as a consumer, you're like, I want season 2. I want the sequel. I want the next thing. And then as a creator, you're like, but I'm bored.
Butterscotch.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 393 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the webs programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's December 9th, 2020. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity on this show. And we'd also like to thank our recurring supporters from moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your monthly donations. It helps keep our microphone tubes full of voice juice.
Yup.
We have almost cleared 2022.
Yeah.
It still feels like 2020.
Yeah.
It does.
The future arrived in 2020 and then just stayed here and became the past, you know?
I think it's also that because we launched Levelhead like right around the time that the COVID lockdowns started.
It was like 2 months later.
Yeah.
It was 1 month later.
It was right after.
Yeah, end of April.
Like we locked down, we went home, launched our game. Then we worked on we did some patching and stuff, but then we started Crashlands 2 at the end of 2020.
Fall 2020.
And it's like it's kind of weird because, you know, I think our memory of time is it's sort of landmark based, right? Like there's big moments that you kind of can identify as like, yeah, that was 2015 because XYZ thing happened.
Yeah, you're
right?
sort of putting memories between other memories, right? Of like landmark events. So you could say kind of what the range was where something happened. And it's like we don't have a lot of the landmarks anymore. And so there's sort of just like a big soup of things that happened.
Yeah, because we had like GDC that we would go to. We had Shenanicon that we would run. We had all kinds of stuff, right? And then, you know, our game launches and like we got our office and, you know, like stuff was always happening before. And now it's like we launched Levelhead, started working on Crashlands 2, and we're still working on Crashlands 2. And it feels like we just never left 2020. Like we're just still in it. Oh, anyway.
Yeah. Which is funny too, right? Because like the work on it has changed dramatically over that course, right? And like our approach to it has changed. We've hit various milestones with it, you know? But because all of it is a little more gradual than like literally going to a place for a one weekend event that happens once a year or whatever, right?
The routine is reinforcing the things that we're doing, like us for example, you know, working on like building the game changer and that kind of stuff. That's still just like get up every day, go to the computer, collaborate, program. You know, we're doing something different, but we're using the same routines and methods to do it, and so it doesn't feel like something huge has happened. It has, I think. But yeah, there's no disruption. I think that's like what your memories are kind of formed around is like when something changes, right? Like Sam, you moved, you know. And that's a big
I moved
thing.
in the middle of this stuff, and that gave me, I think, another bit of extra kind of memory capacity for feeling out the time of all this stuff being able to stay.
That was 2021, right?
Correct. Summer 2021.
Which was a year and a half ago.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah.
It's all
We're approaching 1,000 days of COVID.
Oh,
We're just like,
are we gonna have a party? Is there a birthday party of some
party
kind?
where everybody just gets vaccinated, sort of.
I wish if we had that kind of a party, then we wouldn't have 1,000.
we wouldn't be in this situation.
Well, I do have a good segue for you on this.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of talking about like a Groundhog Day situation of being like, things are definitely happening, but, you know, the routines are largely the same around getting that stuff to happen. So even though you're doing different things, it's all through the same context. And so you start getting this weird, like, have I been here before? Am I trapped in this?
Am I real?
Yeah. What is happening? So this can happen on the game design side too. Okay. Because of iteration. You know, we talk a lot about making games on this podcast. That's mostly what we talk about. And a big part of that is this idea of iterating quickly is generally the only method by which you can effectively make a good game, right? And it's because games are so weird as big interactive things between the designer and the person playing that also then include all sorts of, intense, crazy technological things to even make happen in the first place, that what you're trying to marry at the outset is like an initial vision for the game with, gradually getting to the point where that is the experience that the player has. But along the way, you'll usually find some stuff that from a technical standpoint you can't do, or you have to do slightly differently. And all these have these echoes into just all the rest of the game content, sometimes in very small ways, but in ways that you still have to regard, right? You have to pay attention to them and be like, yes, I respect this change. So, a lot of our work this past year has been in getting the Game Changer up and running, actually, because of this exact problem in the case of Crashlands 2, which was last October. We did some playthrough stuff after getting the game to a point where you could, play it for a while, and coming away with about, a couple pages of notes on a legal pad and realizing that implementing all those changes would take months. And that's kind of, that's not good from an iteration standpoint.
Well, it would take months of programming time, and there would be very little art to create or implement at that time. Right. So you, Sam, would be sort of underutilized in your art capacity. And also we wouldn't be able to be fixing bugs or doing anything. It would just be my programming time just going down that list for a couple of months.
Yeah. And so that's where we said, you know what, we're kind of tired of this being a problem for us. So let's fix it. So we did. And that's where the Game Changer comes in, right? So that's been the story of the podcast for the last, years of change, basically. Yeah. And it definitely has worked. And so what's been fun, though, is that now the iteration speed is just, it's almost sort of instantaneous in terms of saying, oh, we did a playthrough, here's some notes, blah, like the next day, it's all kind of tuned again in a different way. And then for some of these bigger changes where you run into a thing where it's like, oh, systemically, we found out that X is actually the best way for content to be deployed or for the world to be arranged. So let's go back and work through all the content and tune it back up. We're able to do that now on the capacity of a couple of days of, my time while Seth is still, in this case, running off and doing more cool stuff to enable the future stuff, right? So it's all been working really, really well. But the end result of this has been that in the last 2 weeks or so, since we got the progression map put together, which brief reminder for everybody, if you weren't here last 2 episodes, that was the thing that basically allowed us to visualize how people were going to be able to move through the content in Crashlands 2 in a way that essentially made it more explicit what the paths that a player might be taking would be, given how interconnected all the stuff is in the game. This and
how open world it is, right? So because the challenge there was, given a linear game where you know exactly what's going to happen, well, it's easy to map out, but given an open world game where you can take many paths, but all of them can interact with each other at different points and so on, is how the hell do you ask a question like, do we have enough stuff going on after you played the game for 3 hours if you had gone in this direction, kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think a good kind of example of the two modes is if you're thinking about a game like, original Mario, you have the levels, right? And then the player just goes from level to level. And this is the the opposite of an open world concept, right? Where it's like it's on rails, exactly where the player's going to be and where they're going to go next because that's all that you allow, right? So with an open world game, it's a combination of so you create this big open space where the player can go to all these different places, and then you fill the world with all these different kinds of things for the player to interact with, tools for the players to use, abilities for them to use on things for them to make, things for them to discover, right? And you don't necessarily know where they're going to go next or when they're going to go somewhere or what they're going to know when they get there, right? But at the same time, things have to be sequential.
It's still a video game. So
yeah. So if you think about like your Minecraft situation, right? Like you punch trees with your bare fist to get some wood, you turn that into an axe, then you use that axe to chop the tree, and then you use that wood to make more tools, and there's a clear this then that kind of a progression. But along the way, the player can do other things and they can skip steps and all of that. And that's a really simple case if you're just thinking about those tools. But then, how many items are there in Minecraft now? There's hundreds and thousands, right? And so people can make entire working computers in Minecraft and they can do all this stuff. But everything that they do goes through some predefined sequence of like
it arrives temporally at some point, right? You can't just like sort of appear and have everything at once because there's no game at that point. Really, you have you basically have a toy, like a sandbox, right?
Well, and they do have like the creative mode or something where it's like, I just want like redstone, blah, right? But in the normal game, in the survival mode of the game, they can't just manifest something. They've got to go through the steps to get the materials to craft it and whatever. And so it's easy to think, oh, well, it's an open world, so anything can happen. Well, anything can happen as long as the necessary prerequisites happened beforehand, right? Right. And that's the difficulty of plotting out something like this.
Because the reality is that an open world is an illusion in the sense that while it is the case that you might be able to go to most places when you show up, when you appear, if it's the case that you'll be straight up murdered by things at those locations, and also there's stuff there that you can't even quite, like it would just take way too long to mine or whatever else for you to bother with while you're being murdered, then it's an illusion, right? But the thing is that illusion gives you a sense of like, wow, it feels great to have that sense of choice and that sense of agency, and that's why these open world constructs are so fun to play in and so fun to build.
And the boundaries feel like they make sense, and they also feel like if you were clever enough, you could find a way around them. And now, because you feel like you're in control the whole time, I mean, even games like Fallout New Vegas, which is an open world RPG kind of a vibe, right? At the very beginning, like there's a path you can take from where you are to the end, right? Which is like go just like down this like valley kind of pass, right? From just due east. It's a short trip. And it's nothing like the huge you have to go in otherwise, right? But there's just enough high-powered, I think it's scorpions, that the rad scorpions, that live there, that you can't make it because you're just too weak. You've got no armor. Your weapons suck.
You'll be murdered.
You can't do anything. And but you'll be able to make it a little ways, and you can like see like where the end is, And so like you could throw yourself at it a few times before you're like, I think I'll just go the other way, right? But it just feels like you made that choice, even though the game actually did prevent you from doing it.
It's a game of incentives and economics.
Yes.
So you can take your wooden axe, right? And then just only ever use wooden axes to chop trees. But it's a huge pain in the ass, right? Because they break really fast. They barely do any damage, blah, blah, blah. And you can feel the waste of time happening to you, right? And so you take it upon yourself to say like, how do I get a better axe, right? Because this is taking too long. And so even though, you've decided to go make the next axe and the game isn't demanding that you do it, the game's rigged. Like it's set up to make you want to do the next thing. And so that, it's not about putting up invisible walls or whatever. It's about the balance of the game and making it incentivize the player to go down some next path in the open world, right?
Yeah. And so the challenge then basically becomes one of, as we're working on Crashlands 2, we're changing up a bit from the original how exactly you get new recipes and stuff like that. And the whole goal of it is to allow for more basically player discovery and player choice over time, and to sort of reinforce the open world nature of the game a little bit better than we did the first time around. But at the end of the day, you still, like while you're trying to say you can go anywhere, do anything, again, you have to put a progression path in there for players otherwise. And then answer questions about like how truly gated are you between getting your first axe and getting your second axe? Is it the case that like in the original Crashlands, you can't even interact with a thing until you have the second axe? Or is it the case that you can go chop it and it is just a super big pain, right? And so through that process, then you make all these little decisions, seemingly little decisions about like how tools can work or whatever else, that then end up essentially complicating or not complicating the progression path, turning it more, feeling like it's more open or feeling like it's a little more closed. And well, our goal hasn't ever been to make like the most open game. It's basically take the original, open it up more from there, and then just kind of see what we can do. We've been pushing it far enough that it's made it hard to kind of see in the same ways we did before, where it was more procedural and we just kind of knew exactly what was going to happen in each stage. Yada.
Well, because I think that's where the complication comes from. Actually, is the interaction of all of this within the world itself, right? Because the reason this works so easily is not quite the right word, but straightforwardly in a game like Minecraft, right, is because like everything on the surface is the same. It kind of doesn't matter where you are. And like as you dig through the layers, like the progression through the layers is well defined, right? Of like the kind of stuff that's going to happen. So it actually, the part of the world that's open is then randomly distributed in a way such that the fact that it's open doesn't actually impact like how the player is going to move through that space in a way that you have to really worry about that much, right? Versus a game like Crashlands 2, where depending on where you go, like that's where a quest chain starts. That's where a different kind of part of the world is, where there's a boss fight that you do. And we want you to be there at a certain time so that other characters have told you the right information so that you have enough context to know what the hell is happening, when you get to that spot and stuff, right? And so since the world itself can change as it's being designed, and what you're doing in the world can change based on, again, design, where the characters are, what you're supposed to be doing, that all comes back and interacts with this whole, like, how do you interact with things too, right? How do you get to all of those places? And since all of those other components are just like at least little strips of linear content, right? Of you do this, then that, and they can interact with each other in different ways. And the state the player can be in of what they have or haven't done is so combinatorially complex, but all of it then changes what their experience is going to be, and whether it's a designed one or sort of an accidental one, right? Yeah. And that's where the whole challenge comes together of like, how do you then let the player still end up at that spot, or how do you prevent them from ending up there, but in a way that feels soft,
natural,
right? It feels
like,
natural.
Yeah, without an invisible wall, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
How do you make it feel as though you've chosen the path basically the entire time? I mean, in reality, you're in a nicely contained thing such that your experience is good the whole time. So that's kind of what the whole point of the game changer and this progression map and all that stuff has been, is to figure out, okay, we have enough content for a certain kind of chunk of the game at this point. So how do we best arrange that stuff? And then as we've been iterating on it, the thing that's been happening to me, going back to the Groundhog Day point, is that for the last 2 weeks, and I've been rearranging the progression pathway basically through the game and playing it kind of at the end of the week and seeing how that next kind of chunk of content works in terms of how it integrates with the world, et cetera, et cetera. This is also the same thing I did back in like October, I think, before we did our sort of deliverable that we sent over to some business partners and stuff. At that time, we didn't have a progression map, and that was when we were basically getting the onboarding started. So the point of the onboarding then was to corral, at that point, what was basically this giant ball of content into a respectable order that someone could meaningfully walk through and actually understand what the fuck was going on, right? As opposed to just sort of showing up naked in the woods and then wandering off and not having a very good time. And so I've been doing the same kind of thing, right? In an attempt to get a better mental picture about what the rest of the game, in terms of like what, from a templating standpoint, almost like what does the rest of the game end up shaping out to be? How many things are we going to need, between these 2 points in the tier? How does that then reflect on the world? And basically using that progression map as a way of better driving overall production. Now that we're basically, I think we're slowly in the phase now of transitioning actually from pre-production of like getting everything lined up, all the systems ready to go, to actually being able to like really go. But it's been odd because it has been the same question, like the same iterative work on the same part of the system multiple times over the past year, right? In these moments where we're like, okay, we have this new tool up and running. Now we can actually see in this case. But before it was like, hey, we have enough. We have the questing system up and running. So now we can actually do player onboarding as we intend. Cool. Okay. Got to do that sort of version of it. And so it's just this like really weird thing where it's not that you're spinning your wheels, right? It's just that the iteration is the thing, is the measurement that you can use to determine on like the leading side of game development, if it's possible for you to make something good out of the stuff you have, right? It's like how fast can you iterate on any part of the experience, like from the smallest mote of, I don't know, a weapon all the way up to this like whole progression pathway. How quickly can you like kind of spin through it, make changes based on what you've been seeing and thinking about? And yeah, I feel like I've just been in this like really odd space.
Well, it's like we talked about earlier this week, Sam, we were talking about, kind of the throwbacks to the original Crashlands and what that development process was like, and how it did take us, I think it was over a year to get the Savannah, the first zone of Crashlands made, and have like a basic sort of understanding of like the progression path and the kinds of things that the player would have, and be able to do. But once we got to the end of the Savannah, and this is like no boss fights or anything like that, right? Because we didn't actually do that until the last 6 months
quests,
of development.
No boss fights, no
quest. Yeah, this is just like what's in the world and what can the player make, right? And after that first, it took over a year to make that first zone. And then the next zone was 3 months. And then the next zone was 3 months. Mm-hmm. Right. Because all the hard questions are at the beginning where you just keep rebuilding the same stuff over and over again. And then when you get some kind of a new insight about, oh, right, that's why this feels bad, or, oh, this is what's missing. Then you top to bottom, like rebuild that whole thing. And then pretty soon once you have done that enough times and you've built enough tools and systems and stuff to really be able to see and intuitively understand what's fun and engaging and interesting about it.
What's the shape of that design and how does that morph over time and how does it repeat itself over time, basically?
Yeah. Then from there, you can just extrapolate. Like the hard questions are answered. And now you can make the next zone and you can have that branch off of what you had before and have new kinds of things for the player to do, but that are still, within the concepts laid down at the beginning. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of it's the difference between the idea of like a systems development phase of a game and then a content push phase, where once you know how things work, how they fit together, then you can just make stuff, right? And this is something that, like we were talking about earlier in the week, about when we worked on a game changer, a big reason to do it was to say it should be easy to add something. Like once we know that we want something, it should just be like, boom, it's in there now. Right. And with the original Crashlands, everything was equally fairly expensive to add. And so we had to have like a pretty good reason to add something. Right. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to Crashlands 2, we've been talking about like, okay, let's say we've got something out in the world that like does some electrical damage to the player. Right. Well, we know that once the player encounters that, some players are going to be like, man, I just kind of like want to take less electrical damage, from this thing. Then we could get a trinket in there that has some kind of electrical resistance on it. And it would take us 20 minutes start to finish to get that trinket added to the game. Mm-hmm. Now that we understand that and we can kind of see how it all fits together and stuff. But even prior to just this past couple of weeks before we had the progression map, it would have taken us like a whole ass day to figure out how that thing was going to fit and like what it was going to be made of and when the player was going to get it. And, again, it's all about the sequence of things, right?
Yeah, again, it's mainly it's a bigger problem for us in Crashlands because of the nature of Crashlands, which is that stuff is made out of actual things in the world, which isn't the case in a lot of games, right?
Yeah.
So it matters where you put that damn trinket in the progression path because it has to be made of things. It's sort of like a core piece of the game. It's like everything exists sort of in relationship to each other. You don't just have like a weapon dropping out of the sky that's made of just whatever random video game parts, right? It's
and this
made of stones that you've harvested,
And something that I've been really kind of like enthralled by and kind of pumped about is, so I've been playing the new WoW expansion, Dragonflight, and professions are a big, big thing in this version of the game. And professions, and this is like you declare, oh, my character is a blacksmith or something, and you can make, plate armor and weapons for other players. And question is, well, what are you making it out of? Well, you can become a miner as well, and you can go out in the world and like collect different ores and then, refine them. And you can also go find like special magical materials that are used to make them. But ultimately, none of the items that you make visually have anything they don't have anything to do with the components that go into them. Mm-hmm. So really it's more about just the economics of treating the different resources that you're crafting with like currencies that just kind of have, valves that just like release them into the player's inventory over time. Like there's like 2 different kinds of ore that have different levels of rarity, and there's like 4 different kinds of magic things that you can get from all over the place. Right?
And the thing is, like that's good because it decouples these 2 departments essentially in terms of the content, right? You don't have to be like, wait, we cannot actually do the art for this until we know where it sits in the progression flow. But it's a very different thing in a crafting game, I guess, for our purposes. In the case of Crash, that's one of the things that's in the original that we've chosen to keep pulling forward is the sense that everything is made from the world's parts, right? Which is actually a very expensive decision.
Well, I'd say it's expensive until it's not, right? Because because up until now, it has been super expensive to add anything to the game because even though we have the game changer, which allows us to easily add something once we know what it is, we still didn't have the map. We didn't have the progression map that allowed us to see exactly how things fit together. And so now that we do have that, it's not that hard to just say, all right, we want a new trinket. It's going to be at about like this point in the player's progress. What materials do we have available? All right, let's just make it out of these three things. What do they look like? Okay, now we can kind of bring those, colors and motifs into the visuals of the trinket, right? But without that secondary tool, without the progression map, it's like almost impossible to to think of how to fit these things together. But for me, it's been pretty wild because these past couple of weeks have really kind of demonstrated that that you can't ever solve a problem. You can only make different problems. Like you can have
Choose
different
problems.
Yeah. So, or rather, you can solve a problem. That doesn't mean that your problems are solved. You just have different ones now, right? And so the game changer was us saying, let's look at our bottlenecks, and our big bottleneck is programming when it comes to adding stuff to the game. Mm-hmm. How do we make it so that we don't have to use a ton of programming time and resources to add things? It should be trivial to add things, right? And we knew, and we had talked about this over the course of this past year, we knew that would mean that our bottleneck would move to design. Mm-hmm. As in, once it's easy to add something, the hard thing is deciding what to add, right? But for whatever reason, it didn't quite click until these past couple of weeks that's also a tooling problem, right? If it's hard to design, if it's hard to make decisions about what's going to go into the game, it's because there's something that we can't see. There's something that we don't have. There's information we don't have access to that's creating a bottleneck there, right? And so, quite interestingly, I would say, now that we've got this tool, all that I've done over the past couple of weeks is just make more and more tools. And I've been like adding tons and tons of new things for Sam and Jen to use, because now that they can see what they need to do, they're moving super fast, and they're bumping up against all kinds of limitations that previously they weren't able to bump into because they weren't able to move fast enough, right?
Yeah. And I do feel like this is a common problem that you see, because there's a certain amount of progression that you can get out of any particular game idea where things still feel good, right? But then there's always this it's very hard to know how to continue forward from a given position if you can't really see, right? If you can't see what's going to happen. And in a lot of games, it's just the case that, like, we're working on even like Level Head or whatever else, there's these key moments where until we had certain things suddenly made visible, you sort of hit the end. There's some mental bandwidth basically you cannot really meaningfully go beyond. So I think that's kind of the point for me, for any designers listening or any people on game teams, which is like, if it seems like progress is kind of stalling out a bit on, like, meaningful progress on moving the game to that next tier of playtime, or even like the next milestone, if you can identify where it's coming from, it's probably the case that there's some inability to see what the fuck is happening that makes it so hard to think about what to do next, that you essentially cannot decide what to do next. Or if you do, that it's so fraught or takes so much time that you end up just sort of like spinning around in that space, right? Because you make the decision and then it's wrong and you have to remake it and whatever else. And so it feels like it's always a signal, to see if there's a place to bump up the visibility of what you're doing.
I think this also sort of reveals the kind of incorrectness of the model that there's like a bottleneck, right? Because it isn't really the case that because like the game changer made it easier to put stuff in the game, that allowed people to go faster than bump up against this bottleneck that wasn't there previously, right? Because it was the same problem already existed. It was already really hard to design stuff. You already couldn't see the full context to figure out like where the design should go, right? It was just that you had enough time because you couldn't get the thing in the game anyway, right? Mm-hmm. That it didn't feel bad from a production standpoint, because you were like, well, I can't get something in, so it's okay that like my life kind of sucks and I don't really know what to do and this is really hard, right? But the reality is that that was always true. And I think this is why I prefer to focus on the cognitive load problem, right? Because everyone, no matter what your work is, no matter how it fits into the network of all the things that work together, right? Your actual moment-to-moment work is some combination of the problems you're trying to solve and the tools that you have to expose all the components at the right time to make it so that you can do that. And how hard that is basically a function of like, it's cognitive load. It's can you see the stuff? How big and elaborate and accurate does your own mental model need to be to get that job done, right? And while getting everybody on the team and all the different roles into a position where their mental model can be constructed really fast, and it's being supplemented by stuff that they can go easily just go see the right stuff at the right time to make the decisions they need to make. Then even if, because the bottleneck of production is, comes from basically how these things all talk to each other, right? And how enabled you are to move from one part of the network of interacting things to the next. But the process of actually doing that work, which is what we all actually experience, day to day and minute by minute, is the cognitive load problem. And I think it's when you relieve a bottleneck, then what you've actually done is made it so that the cognitive load that somebody else is already experiencing now becomes also a production problem, right? And so
previously things were moving slow enough that even though it was hard to think about, they had enough time to think about it because they didn't have anything else to do.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that was good. It doesn't mean that they were having a good time doing that. It doesn't, and because the fact is, like, because as we're describing this stuff, the reality is that each of these components of the network of the work has gotten so much better, right? If you think about quality, not about actual like productive capacity, right? But just about the quality of the output and then the quality of like the time spent, building it. Like that's the stuff that is for everybody continue just to get better and better and better and better and better, right? And so while it's true that like the production bottleneck keeps on bouncing around, right? In terms of like how stuff actually makes it out eventually, right? Everyone's experience across the board and the quality of the output that everybody is making is just shooting up and keeps on going.
You're getting closer to basically being able to move from initial design concept to a delivered thing that is the correct thing the first time, right? And if it's not, then all the tooling exists such that you could tell basically really, really quickly, and then you could get it iterated on so that it is the correct thing. And then even better, once you've done that a bunch, once you realize again, like all these things have echoes, and so you feel out the next shape of the overall arching design for the thing as you're building up more content. Once you hit that point, then you could say, "Oh, I see what the shape is now," and then you walk backward, boom, 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 and you tune everything into that kind of new to better work with that shape, right?
Yeah,
and that's the sort of thing like.
But think about how much easier it is now. Like now that you have these tools with this, this new view, this way of viewing how stuff. Versus the game, right? And think about what does it mean to redo that work now versus what it meant to redo that work in October, right? And and it's both of those things because now the mental model you need to construct to be able to do it is so much tinier because the model exists out in the world in a way that you can grok and explore. Like, and you can get, when you have a question about the model, the answer's there. You can just go grab it, right? And so what that's enabling you to do is construct just a much more accurate design in the first place, right? Of like what happens next much more easily and much more fun and with the just higher quality.
Yeah, it's been a while, and there's been also several kind of like aha moments that in retrospect it's like duh, but when we first put up the progression map, it was pretty rudimentary in terms of not everything was hooked into it, and it was kind of like, is this a good thing to keep working on, right? But one of the things that was kind of a weird sticking point was the problem of quests. Because quests can do all kinds of things, including they can give you items and they can demand that you have items or they can demand that you've done something. And quests have multiple states where, you first talk to somebody or whatever, you start the quest, and now the quest is active. And then some amount of time will pass, right? Could be a long time, or it could just instantly end right there and you move on, right? And then
There could be a
to
quest that
finish-
starts the moment you hit the game that doesn't end until you beat the final boss.
Yeah, and it might be an invisible quest in the background even that you don't even see in your quest log, right? It's just something that we're using to kind of like as a logic node for other quests or something. So quests can do all kinds of things, and then they also can hook into other requirements where, for example, you can have a quest that can only be started if you're currently on another quest. But once you're done with that quest, you can't do it anymore, right? And all this weird stuff. And when we first put together the progression map, quests, because in our mind, like a quest is a thing. It's one thing, right? Then we kept having this problem in the progression map where a quest existed in one spot on the progression map. And eventually we ran into problems where quests kept creating infinite loops because, for example, a quest may start where at the start of the quest, somebody gives you a recipe. And the quest will end once you've crafted that thing, and then they'll have something to say about it. So this item both comes from and is required for that quest, which means you've got an infinite loop and we don't know what the hell to do, right? And so this was one of those kind of aha moments where, oh, yeah, a quest is actually two different things. A quest is a start point and an end point, and those actually are oftentimes in very different places on the in the progression map with a bunch of stuff in between, right? And so, once you can see stuff laid out, then you start to get a better sense of how your human brain is sort of bundling things together or categorizing things in a way that is actually not accurate. It's like not actually true to how the game works and what the player is going to be.
Oh, and even if it is accurate, it still may be increasing your cognitive load because there's another also accurate way, right, of like modeling it that allows you to now fit this new model into a context that's easier for you to collectively understand and work with. And I think that to me, like that's what so much of like doing programming is about, or like trying to figure out how the world works from a statistical standpoint or something. If you're doing experiments, right? It's always like, it's basically taking the model that you have and figuring out a new way to model that exact same thing, but in a way that allows you to get handholds on it so you can do stuff and you can ask questions, right? And I think that's so much of what this stuff actually is the discovery that, and I think that the trick here, especially with like games, right, is because games, you're modeling fairly tangible concepts, because even the idea of like a quest feels very tangible, even though it's pretty abstract also, right? But like it feels tangible. And the more natural that concept is that you're modeling in terms of like you already have a human sort of construct associated with it, the harder it is to see how you could change how you're thinking about it and change how you're modeling it so that you can interact with it more easily. Because it's so hard to get away from the idea that, a rock is a rock, right? When the reality in the game context is, well, the rock is this like data payload with these sets of interactions and then this like graphical inspection, right? To the point where like the idea of like an inventory item and a thing in the world can actually become the same thing because of this like overlap between them, right?
I think this is why it's just like really funny, whenever you work on a game for long enough, which I think it feels like it's about maybe like 3 months or so. I feel like after you work on a game for about 3 months, at least I know for me personally, then your ability to trust that you even understand the experiential part of it starts to kind of drift a little bit. You get a little, I'm very suspicious basically of myself at this point in terms of, is the experience that I'm having with this what a player will have? Like, how can I get close to that? Because while it is true at the end of the day that you're making these bits and pieces of stuff that are concrete, right? The thing that you're trying to get is completely abstract. And I think it's not like a tool where you're saying, okay, yeah, can I use, I don't know, like I said, pickaxe is a fun example. Can I use this tool to efficiently get some like ore out of the ground, right? In the real world, in real terms. It's like a yes or a no sort of a thing. And there's like an improvement piece to it. In the case of like, any kind of, I think more creative media in particular, you're trying to ask like, okay, here's all these concrete things that I'm doing. It's supposed to enable what is a invisible internal experience for people, right?
Yeah.
And measuring
is this going to feel good for the player to do this?
But feeling good can also include feeling bad in certain kinds of ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like, what is it? Is it going too fast? But is it also too slow? Like, what's the, all these different situational things? And I think it's just like, it's just a trip because you start especially when you're iterating on these things, you're playing the same content over and over again. And if people were wondering like, why do video games take so long to make? Like it is true. Like, of course, if you're making something at scale, like it does take a long time to make any one of the pieces of it, but that usually isn't the fucking problem. The problem is not like the bricks, like a number of bricks required to make the damn building. It's just like,
it's how it all comes together.
Yeah, well, this is a good segue actually, because we do have a question about this. This question comes from Fraser, from over at podcast.bscotch.net. And Fraser asks, how do you estimate timelines in game development?
Yeah, the only good solution is to not do that. You can dictate timelines, right? As in you can say, something has to happen. We have a deliverable or whatever by this date, right? And usually it's going to be ideally that should be some kind of an external constraint, like we run out of money or a publisher required it or whatever, right? Or we just, it's usually money driven. It's just like, if we don't get this game out by X, we just don't have money left, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not an estimate. That's an external requirement. Yeah. And I think this is where like the whole idea of like estimating how long something is going to take that's the wrong direction to take it, right? Because it should be the opposite, which is here's how long we have. What can we do in that time? Right.
Yes.
And that as you get closer to a deadline, you continue to reevaluate to figure out what you need to change or pare back or whatever, so that you also have the answer to the fundamental question of like what at root fundamentally has to happen, right? If our deliverable to a publisher is due here in like 60 days, right? What is the absolute minimum thing that has to be able to land on their desk, right, for that goal? Because that doesn't necessarily mean like you need the completed game. It doesn't necessarily mean you even need a good experience, right? As long as you've got like a golden path. And there might be some shortcuts you can take. There might be some interaction with them as a person where you can say, hey, this isn't where we want it to be. It's janky as fuck. Yeah. So now maybe you can cut back on like making sure it all works, right? Or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Because the question is just like, again, what actually has to happen by then? And then given that time, how do we get that to happen? That whatever that thing is. And doing it that direction is also what allows you to avoid horrible crunch. It also allows you to keep things from getting inflated at scale, right?
Well, it can allow you to
do
those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think largely it is what causes crunch because people don't use the deadline to update the design or the vision.
Yeah, it requires that part. You have to be able to change that's also why we treat things as like we have finite time. We've got the hours we expect from everybody per day for work, right? And that means that if we say like, well, by this date, we need to have X happen, that doesn't mean we have to figure out how to put enough hours in that we get that outcome. Right. It means that given the hours that we have available, how do we get something that satisfies that goal?
Yeah. And it's a good decision metric to think about. Once you have your timeline and your goal, then what else can you fit in there? Like, how do you adjust the design of the game and what is it you're trying to make such that you can also get some other long-term benefit out of that time? So like what we've been doing with Crashlands 2 is we straight up gave ourselves, we want to give ourselves 3 to 4 years to work on Crashlands 2. Mm-hmm. So like we want to give ourselves a lot of time because we've got some questions. Yeah. Okay. We want to do some experiments with multiplayer. We want to, put together a huge game design document and see, because we've never really done that. We want to put together a huge game design document and see if we can do some experiments with pre-production, do some experiments with visuals, try some new tools. So we switched over to Spine.
Mm-hmm. We want to fundamentally change the entire way that work flows in the studio. We're going to add more people in.
Yeah, we want to be able to scale things up, right? And so, we definitely could have made Crashlands 2 in under 2 years.
A Crashlands 2.
Yeah. Yep.
Not the current one, though.
But if we had decided to do that, then what we would have done along the way would be completely different from what we're currently doing, which is we would have stuck with the tools that we had. We would have stuck with a lot of the design models that we had before. We wouldn't have done things that we weren't sure whether they were going to work out, right? We wouldn't have done our multiplayer experiment. Mm-hmm. It would have been a lot more of like sort of a copy paste of existing design paradigms.
I would call this Crashlands again. not Crashlands 2, right?
Crashlands, comma TOO.
Yeah, continued.
Yeah. Because like, is it meaningfully building on the stuff that you had in the first? Well, of course, maintaining as much of the design paradigm as you need to, but is it maintaining, or is it building on the spiritual concept that's like baked in there, or is it just literally more? And that's not necessarily bad. Again, it's like not bad at all to have like just mainly more. Depends on where you're at, what you need.
Yeah, well, I think it's like timelines, and like this discussion also it highlights the question of just long-term versus short-term and where your time should be going. What's valuable, right? And I think from a long-term standpoint, the thing that is always the most valuable is for people to have the opportunity to try stuff, experiment, have things go wrong, right? And because I think when you say, here's how it has to be done and we need it done by this time, right? The removal of any room for flexibility there of like discovering, oh shit, there's a better way, or the people involved developing new knowledge and skills because they got to explore spaces around this problem, right? Every time you remove an opportunity for that, then you're cutting out enormous long-term gains from, because these investments up front that build on each other make it so that each person involved with the process, like if you think about the stuff that Sam can do now because of his exploration of like Clip Studio Paint and new ways of doing art, and he's took time on studio time, like doing art courses and stuff, right? To like learn new ways of thinking about stuff. And then we took time to then build pipelines around the workflow he ended up with, right? And if we hadn't done all of that, and if Sam hadn't done all of that, then his ability to produce the kind of art that he's now producing just wouldn't be there, right? It would still be good because like at minimum it would be like Crashland, OG Crashlands, right? But we've moved into this like whole new world of like the cool shit that can come out of that and how fast it comes out and what the process looks like and how it intersects with the rest of development. And just none of that would have happened.
Yeah. Well, and even more interestingly, we think about Levelhead, because Levelhead felt like it happened pretty fast. Like with as much
It was a 2-year
stuff
project. It was
a 2-year project, but when did we start working on it? 2 years after we launched Crashlands.
Yeah.
Because what happened in the meantime was lots of R&D.
Yeah, that's true.
Lots of trying to figure out how to do stuff. How do we maintain a game like Crashlands with an existing player base? Is that even the right thing to do, financially from a business perspective? How do we scale up the studio? We developed Rumpus for over a year, I think, prior to Levelhead even starting development.
Yep.
And we had several game prototypes and projects that we were experimenting on all throughout 2017, none of which ended up being Levelhead, but all of which informed a lot about stuff that we needed to do going forward to make Levelhead possible, right? So it's kind of weird because, essentially Levelhead was over a 3-year project. We just didn't know it for the first year, right? Because we were doing a bunch of tools development and all that stuff that made Levelhead possible. Well, with Crashlands 2, we're doing this, more purposefully, where that kind of development is happening in service of something that we know we want to make, which is Crashlands 2.
Well, this is another answer to the question of like, how is it that you can look at a game? You start playing a game and like you really like the design decisions. You can see why they did everything. Like, oh, this all makes sense. And you look at it, and you're like, it seems like just anybody could like make this, because like you feel like you can summarize like, here's the design, here's how it all works, here's how it all comes together, right? And you can do this with pretty complicated games, right? And so the question is then, why aren't there 100 breath of the wilds, whatever, right? Why aren't there? I mean, there's not even 2, right? I guess there's a second one coming out, but there aren't even 2 games that like hit that in that particular way that give that impact on the player, right? What did it take to make that game actually, right? Well, it took 20 years of a Zelda franchise, right?
Yeah.
Plus the institutional knowledge of the Nintendo staff, right? And all of their contract, like all the people that are associated with these things, right?
Probably an insane amount of hardware tech.
Oh, absolutely.
Fuckery because
all
of
the hardware stuff. Yeah.
Switches,
Yeah. It took an enormous amount of background stuff that actually it would be reasonable to like at first blush think, well, that's just a different thing. Because the real thing is just like you sit down, you design the game and you make it, right? With the tools available, right? But that's discounting all of the institutional knowledge and skill that lives in the people and in the tools and in the organizational structures that come together to make these things, because these don't live in a vacuum, you know. And the reason these are hard isn't because of like the specific details of the thing. It's that with any large scale project, it has to come from the net capability and knowledge and organizational structure of the context that it comes out of. And having something really complicated that's also good
It's hard as fuck.
is so fucking hard, because again, it's not because like the hindsight part is easier. You can just look at it and be like, oh yeah, well, like they designed this way because X happens and so on, right? But if you like when Crashlands 2 comes out and if people are playing it, and if it goes as well as we think it will, there'll be people looking at it being like, oh, this is really cool. Like I see what they did here, like why they did this, right? And the things that they're looking at right now that look like obviously the best move, right? Obviously the thing that we should have done might be stuff that we didn't even realize we should do, or did but didn't have the capability to do, right? Until a year and a half into the project, where like that fact then like caused us to be like, oh, and then restructure the whole thing again, right? So that the net effect that you see, that's the whole tip of the iceberg idea, right? It's like the thing, it's just so easy to use your hindsight and say like,
Obviously.
And that's also why you know, we're generally playing things pretty close to the vest when it comes to actually showing Crashlands 2, because you know, I'm confident that 6 months from now, the starting player experience will be 100% different
oh yeah,
than it is right now. Because I mean, even we were just talking this morning, with the tools that we've gotten over this past couple of weeks, there's like a 40 minute section of the new player experience that is now like 5 minutes. And it's so much punchier and funnier, and it's more clear what it is that's happening, what the player has to do. And you know, before we were like, yeah, this is good, right? And the thing is, it was as good as we could have conceived of doing it, given what we had available to us, right? Now that we've got better tools and we can do more with them, we took that long drawn out thing and we just made it way better and way punchier. And now you're just like right into the action and having a much better time, much faster, right? So we'll extrapolate that, you know, that across everything in the game, stuff that was kind of confusing, kind of drawn out, kind of long, kind of hard to understand as a player, whatever. It just gets 10 times better, right? And you just do that multiple times throughout development, and you can see why you'd be hesitant to show somebody the game kind of at any point until it's about to be released, right? Because at that point, at that point, you could still be making those changes, but you have to stop working on it at some point so you can sell it and, you know.
Well, I think wasn't it not this past summer, but the summer before, that we were doing a whole bunch of really active biz dev on it. We were trying to show the game to people. That was 2 summers ago, I'm pretty sure. And that was when I was like really trying to push that stuff, so that Sam and Seth could keep on.
As in like in the first 6 months of development?
Yeah, or it was after the first. Yeah, it was the first 6 months of like really active development after the first, because it started.
We basically gotten the art style to a point where we were like, I think this is basically where it's at. And then we had build mode. We had like a creature.
Yeah, a whole bunch of like those core like interactive experiences were
you could
there,
see it,
right? You could see it. You could tell what was going to go on. But even at that time, when it was still really hard to do all of this stuff, and iteration was really slow and costly, right? It was still the case at that point that things changed so fast that when I was doing like active biz dev, I was really hesitant to actually send people like a video, right? Because I'd look at the video that we had that Sam had made like the prior week, and I'd look at the game now a week later and be like, it's already missing so much stuff, right? And then I'd also know what was coming up the following week and be like, oh, but if we just wait, it'll be so much more compelling, you know? And that's true, right? And we're trying to find that time to actually show it to people because of this fact that it's just the whole process is this long iterative thing, because of the whole intangibleness of the experiential aspect of playing a game. It doesn't matter how clever you are as a designer, right? And how good your taste is and how good your design sense is. Because the reality is that until you've actually experienced it in the context of the whole thing, and the context of a whole game is fucking enormous, that you can't hold it in your brain. It's just not possible. The only thing you can do is experience it sort of holistically, just as a person. You know, you can't actually reason their way all the way through it.
One of my favorite things seeing in like after a game comes out and does really well is usually if they interview some of the devs on it or the game director or whatever. There's always a sense from the game director or core content team or whatever where they're like, yeah, honestly, it didn't come together until close to the end. That's like a very common thing.
Yeah, always.
I know there's literally like the God of War Ragnarok team said that about this new one that just came out.
Well, and I saw some articles where so many people were hearing about the fact that the God of War Ragnarok team was like really apprehensive about whether they had made something that was even any good.
Even good. Yes.
And all the players are like, really? Like, really? You guys couldn't tell? And it's like, yeah, really? Like,
you really can't fucking tell.
Because honestly, probably that game sucked ass until like 6 months before launch.
Yep.
Right? Like, it's just how it goes.
They'd all been working on it so hard and for so long, and their mental models had been like rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed over and over and over again, right? Mm-hmm. To the point where because you get towards that point and you really cannot tell. You
become like a weird nihilist where you're like,
everything
what is
now.
good?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know what's good. Nobody knows what's good, and I just need to rearrange these nodes, sort of thing. And,
yeah,
I mean, even saw that with Elden Ring. The guy said they asked the director, and he was like, "Honestly, I don't know why it did so well."
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, because people were asking him, are they going to make follow-on games? He's like, "Oh yeah, of course. Like, yeah, we'll make more, but don't expect." Them to be anywhere near as popular or successful as Elden Ring, because like we don't know why the fuck that happened.
Yeah,
it's like we didn't do anything that different from what we've done in the past.
Well, that's actually a really important because that's something we talked about a lot too in the past is the survivorship bias problem, especially in the indie space, right? But it is true through AAA as well, and AAA it's different because success does cause future success when success is big enough, right? But it also can create a tower that can really fall if you fuck it up well enough, right?
Yeah.
But otherwise, like it is the case. Like, I mean, famously, Steam's whole thing back in the olden days of Steam, like they put out 12 games a year on the Steam.
And you
service,
would
right?
send your game to their publishing team and say, "Can my game go on Steam?" And they would play and evaluate it. And they'd say no.
Yeah. And like there's almost nothing there, and it was only from really big publishers, right? And they started to kind of like squirt out some like interesting indie titles, right? But it was still going through this process. But over time, they started they had a better content team. They started to add kind of more and more stuff because they were like, "Oh, this is a cash cow." Once we start to put games through here, but they were trying to pick winners, right? They were trying to like look at all the things that were coming to them and trying to say, "Okay, we think this one will do well, so we'll put this one in." Because their goal was to say, as a platform, you can just come here and buy a game; it's going to be fucking great, right? And as they started to actually add more content and went beyond just a dozen a year or whatever, they very quickly discovered, we can't guess what's going to do well.
Like we thought this was going to be great and nobody bought it. And this other one we were kind of wishy-washy about and it went crazy.
Yeah. They couldn't tell. And so that was then their impetus for Steam Greenlight, which at the time was to say, okay, let's see if like, because it's the people who decide if the game is popular because they're who make it popular. So what if we can pre-check with the people, right? So that we still only let in winners, right?
It's like Kickstarter.
It's like Kickstarter, yeah. But we let in the ones that people have chosen. That way, it's already people have already passed judgment, and now we know it'll be a hit, right? So they did that. It wasn't even very long. It was maybe 3 years or something. It wasn't. It just really wasn't that long.
It was during Crashlands we did a Greenlight.
Yeah, because we had a really successful Greenlight campaign. And then still during that though, then these games actually came out, right? And it was the same deal, right? It was just some of them were hits, some of them were not. And some things didn't get through Steam Greenlight the first time, but then did the second time and then were a hit. Like it was just complete unpredictable chaos. And then so finally Steam was like,
fuck it.
Fuck it. We can't guess. So we're going to just let everything on here. And then we're going to try to algorithmically boost stuff that seems to be catching people's attention. And that became the model because they just couldn't guess, right?
Yeah.
And so this whole idea, like it is so easy in retrospect to look at a really successful title and say, oh, here's why it was successful, right? Yeah. But there's a reason why most indies who make a really popular title don't make a second popular one, right? Even if you could look back and say, here's why the first one was successful, right? It's because the fact is you can't. You can come up with, we call them just so stories in science, right? Where it's like, you just like can construct a nice little narrative about how that came to be and be like, look, you could just like draw these perfect lines like this event happened, and the design, they decided to go this way, whatever, right? But that isn't how reality
It's just a
actually
story.
is.
That's just
And
a story. I would say indies are notoriously anti-sequel, I guess I would say.
Yeah, that's also true. I mean, we were,
Right.
yeah.
Yep. We were
Yeah,
in that
because the
camp.
thing is, like if Super Meat Boy 2 came out, I'd be on it. If FTL 2 came out, I would be on it.
Yeah. Yep.
But
Absolutely.
those things did not happen, right? Instead, like nothing happened with Super Meat Boy. We saw a bunch of like prototype projects that Ed McMillan was working on, and then I think there was like
Binding of Isaac. That was the one. That
Yeah,
actually
Binding of
was
Isaac, yeah.
bigger. Yeah.
yeah, which did well, but then no Binding of Isaac 2, right? Like indies love to like
Oh no, they've done, but I think he didn't make it. I think he gave it to like Nicholas or something, like one of the other development teams to basically make like the future versions. So he didn't, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. He's like, I'm done.
I don't want to make another one.
Yeah, because a lot of indie developers, like, you know, they got into it because they're like, yeah, I like making games and I like doing weird, new, interesting things. And, you know, making sequels doesn't really jive with that. But yeah, like I would have loved, I think to me, FTL is kind of the big one because
totally.
FTL, you know, it's spaceship rogue, like nothing else like it out there.
and it's just so good.
It's so good.
Yeah.
And there's so many cool new places they could have taken that concept. But then they made Into the Breach, which is almost like an XCOM, like tactical mech battling strategy game.
It's very cool.
But it's not
and great.
FTL.
Yeah.
It's good, completely different. And then of course we did the same thing, right? Yeah. Like we made Levelhead out, like we had Crashlands. Everybody's like, yeah, Crashlands, when's Crashlands 2 coming out? And we're like, never. And then we just went and made a platformer thing. And then
Hades 2
Hades 2
got
got
announced at the Game
announced.
Awards last night, and I was like,
good.
yes.
And that's their first sequel, right?
It's their first sequel.
Yeah,
And I was like,
exactly,
yeah,
yeah.
good.
And the world is fucking just jazzed about it, right?
Oh yeah,
You know?
because
So
people
we're so
want
excited.
more. People want more of a thing that they're confident is going to be great, right?
Yep.
And like
It's hard enough to find a good thing. You know what I mean? I just watched Wednesday on Netflix, and it's so good. If you haven't watched, watch it. But like,
I had a blast. It was very fun.
it's the same deal where I'm like, this is so good. I just want, if there was a second one, I would.
Oh yeah,
immediately-
absolutely. Did you watch the
I would just keep
whole
on watching.
season?
I did. It's very good.
Yeah, the end, it kind of gets messy in my opinion, like because it kind of felt like they were like, oh, we have all these threads and we now need to tie them all together, and they just kind of like
I mean, they got it
forced some a little bit.
they got more seasons.
But it was still
Cool,
fun,
I'm sure.
and the first up until like the very end, when they try to tie it all together really fast. It was purely just I just had a fucking great time all the way through.
Rare show. Yeah, it's hard to find a thing that is good. That's the truth. Which also means it's very hard to make a thing that's good.
It's hard to make a thing as good, yeah. And this is why,
And then it's hard to know that it's good while you're making it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's hard to marry that desire, like as a consumer. You're like, I want season 2, I want the sequel, I want the next thing, and then as a creator, you're like, but I'm bored. I'm not going to make the next thing. So you know, you got to kind of get over that and give the people what they want. You know. But anyways, we are out of time.
let's go.
So thanks for the question, Fraser. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa Acosta for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye.